Hi everyone, it's Tracie Kiernan from stepbysteppainting.net, and in this tutorial I will show you how to paint this Four Seasons tree. I'm doing this tutorial with the Salvador Acrylic Paint Kit. You can get this kit off of Amazon. Right now it's listed for just under $20, which is actually a really good price for what you get. You get a whole bunch of brushes. I'll be using 3 different sizes for this painting, and I'll show you which ones I use in a second. You get 24 paint colors, and these are actually really decent acrylic paints. They feel much like professional quality artist paints, so they're thick and buttery. And you also get a palette and an artist sponge and a palette knife. I really enjoyed using this paint kit to design this Four Seasons tree, and I talk a little bit more about these paints in the blog post, but this video is going to demonstrate how to do this painting, and I'm going to go ahead and get started with this demonstration. This is a Four Seasons tree, so it's essentially 4 paintings in one. So we need to divide our canvas into 4 different quadrants. Since I'm doing this on an 8" by 10" canvas, I marked the 4" middle part and the 5" middle part. If you're doing a different size canvas, you would just find the middle and divide it into 4. So this can be done on any size canvas. What I'm doing right now is I am masking. I'm going to do the upper left quadrant first, and I'm masking off this area so when I paint, it's not going to go over to the other side of the quadrants. So we're going to do the upper left first, and we're going to do a snowy background. Grab your titanium white and load a little bit on your palette, and also grab the Oxide Black and load a little bit of that on your palette. The Oxide Black is very similar to a Mars Black, so if you're doing a different brand of paint for this tutorial, you can use the Mars Black. We're gonna mix some of that black and white, so I grabbed a big chunk of that white and just a little bit of the black, and I'm just gonna kind of swirl it around. Okay, so these paints are thick and buttery, as I mentioned. We want to create sort of a thinner consistency, so I am going to dip my brush in some water and kind of just swirl it around in my palette. It's going to turn into a gray because the water is causing the white and the black to mix all the way together, but what we really want is this thin wash background. We don't want thick paint, we want thin paint. So we're going to do the black and the white. We're going to paint up and down, and the colors are going to sort of blend more together into a pretty solid gray, but I'll show you how to create some different color variations in that background. So up and down, thin wash of white and black. And so I'm going to reload some more white on there and kind of dip it in there, and adding my water to the tip of my brush, adding in that paint because it's a very thick paint, but the water will slightly thin it down to make it more of a thinner consistency. So you see what happened that time when I added more white into my gray, so we got more of that streaky look that we like, that I like, with the abstract looking snowy background. If I add a little tiny bit of black in there, like on the corner of my brush, and I stroke it up and down, that black will sort of blend a little bit more. You just don't want to add too much black in there because the black is so strong it'll take over fast. So tiny bit of black on your corner. And I don't ever let my paint dry all the way before lifting the tape off, so we want to gently lift that tape off, and you should have an area in the upper left quadrant for the snowy scene. We're going to do the next quadrant next, and this is going to be the spring one. It's going to be done with brilliant blue and white, and I took my tape and I masked off the upper right area of the canvas. We're going to use brilliant blue and titanium white, and we're going to do the same technique again. So I have the titanium white, And I'm going to get my brush, get all that gray rinsed off of that brush. By the way, this is the number 10 flat brush. I failed to speak it earlier, but it is in text when I started painting the snow. So this is the number 10 flat brush. Grab a little bit of the brilliant blue on your corner and sort of just swirl it around in that white. Do this same thing with the water, so you slightly thin that paint down because it is nice and thick, but it thins down very easily. And do your up and down thing. Now, the thing with the water, you don't want to ever add too much water into your acrylic paints because that could mess with the ability for it to bind to the canvas. And also because we have the tape, we don't want too much water seeping under the tape. So you want to be just kind of careful not to add too much water. It shouldn't be dripping. So if you're working on an easel with the canvas vertically, I'm working flat on the table, but if I was working on an easel, it should not be watery enough to where it starts dripping down the canvas. Just a little bit so that it thins it down slightly, and we can create that nice thin layer wash that we want in the background. So I'm going to just kind of mess with my colors, adding more white if I want more streaks of white in there. Same thing with the blue. If I prefer more streaks of blue in there, I would do more streaks of blue. So super easy. And this technique is going to be done to all 4 quadrants, only different combinations of color. This brilliant blue, I guess, is equivalent to, I wouldn't say equivalent, but it's very close to a cerulean blue. So if you're trying to convert colors, a cerulean blue would work for this. Maybe a light blue permanent. But this one is just creating kind of a sky blue color. So any kind of light blue color with the white would work. And I'm taking that brilliant blue and I'm kind of adding streaks in there just to give it that more streaky look that I like to see in the background. And so I'm going to rinse my brush off and carefully lift this tape up. My video is going a little bit in fast motion, so I didn't really lift my tape off that fast, but you want to gently lift it off. And then I'm going to do the lower left quadrant and apply the tape gently over painted areas. You don't want to add it on too tight on there because it could lift the paint off, so just gently apply it to the painted area. We are going to use, I believe this is primary yellow. Yes, it is primary yellow. And we're going to also freshen up some titanium white on our palette. And we're also going to use primary magenta. Now for me, this primary magenta was very close to like a primary red color. It's a reddish color that has like a hint of pink to it. And so we're going to do the sunset. Same technique with the number 10 flat brush. We want to create a thinner layer in our paint. I'm actually getting all that color off of there. Still have a little bit of blue in my brush there, but that was okay. So let's start with the white. Load a big glob of white on the brush. And grab a little bit of yellow on the corner, kind of swirl it around. And so it's the yellow and the white create this very brilliant yellow color, but adding some of that magenta in there will create that sunset look. Now that magenta is a very strong color. It will turn red very fast if you grabbed too much red on your brush. So just a little bit on the corner, and I'm not blending it all the way. I want that yellowish reddish look without it blending all the way. And then the white, and of course if you need to add a little bit more water in there to sort of thin it out a little bit better, you can. This paint actually spreads very nicely for me. I'm not constantly having to reload my brush over and over again. I am going to add some more titanium white in there, and you can see here what happens. It's going to lighten the background a bit more just by adding that titanium white in there and streaking it into your yellow and red sort of combos. White helps to blend the colors a little bit better. I almost went through that entire tube of titanium white. This is the second time I'm doing this painting on an 8x10. So these tubes are really small. You go through titanium white very fast with acrylic painting. But it does come with an extra tube of titanium white. I'm not sure how long the other tubes will last because they are really small. That was the one downside that I found with this kit, was how tiny the tubes are. But what I'm doing right now is I'm adding a little bit more red in there just to give it sort of a more streaky red look. And sometimes you just have to play around with the colors and keep mixing and blending until you get the combo that you like. Okay, so we are done with the sunset quadrant. We're going to do the summer quadrant. So gently lift off that tape, and we're going to do the summer quadrant with Ultramarine Blue and some titanium white. So Ultramarine Blue, titanium white combo. Still using that number 10 brush. Get all that red and yellow white rinsed off the brush. Okay, so same technique as the other quadrants, only we're working with 2 colors this time and not the 3 colors. So we're going to apply the Ultra, thin it down just a little bit with the brush, adding it on there, thinning it with the water by dipping your brush in the water and sort of thinning it out. Again, it should not be dripping wet. It should be thin enough to where the paint thins out but not drips down the canvas. And I forgot to apply my tape to this quadrant. I was going to try to do it without the tape here. So I'm going to gently add that tape on there. We just want to make sure when we apply it very gently to the already painted area that we're not putting the tape on so tight that it's going to rip the paint off. All right. And one thing that I ended up discovering with this dark blue is it seeped under the paint because that dark blue is such a strong color. And I think maybe I had probably a little bit too much water and the water seeped under. But very, very minor mishap with that paint going under the tape. But if that happened to you, if your paint seeped under the tape, this acrylic paint is very opaque, and you can actually let it dry and then rework the color. It'll go over, paint over. It's got very good coverage. All right, so there is my blue combo. I think I'm going to add a little bit of more white in there just to give it some more character with that white. And then don't forget to paint the sides. I forgot to paint the sides of my painting, but it would look very pretty if you extend the colors on the sides of the canvas as well. Alright, so gently lift your tape. You can see what happened on the very top. The blue kind of seeped up on the top. But that super easy fix. You would just take your white and brilliant blue combo and just kind of touch it up a little bit. Okay, so this next part of the painting is drawing the tree. And so I have a couple options for you. You can print out my Traceable. My Traceable is the exact same drawing of this tree. So you can use that Traceable and transfer it to the canvas. It's an 8x10 unless you want to enlarge it for a larger canvas. Or you can free draw the tree with a piece of chalk. So at the bottom of the painting is where our trunk exists. The kind of the roots. They start out kind of wide. I think about the trunk itself is about 2 fingers wide. The bottom part with the roots, probably about 3 or 4 fingers. It curves out like a trumpet. And then our branches start forming. And you kind of want to think about where your branches are. You want to make sure that we have branches hanging down for the summer quadrant. And basically there should be branches in each of the quadrants. So we have our branch hanging down for the summer, and I'm just lightly sketching this out with my chalk. The nice thing about chalk is it erases. And then this branch is going to go straight up. This branch is going to kind of hang out in the winter section, but make a curve to the spring section. And this winter is going to have quite a few branches. And so I have another branch kind of curving up into the winter section. And the thing with branches is they start out thick and they go to a point. So they get thinner and thinner and thinner until the point sort of makes the branch disappear. And the trunk itself is like a trumpet. It curves downwards and it opens up at the bottom where the roots are. And When I do drawings, I lightly sketch it out first, but then when I like the branch, I'm going to press harder with that chalk because I want that one to be a permanent one. If I needed to erase, I can use my finger to erase it, which kind of smears the chalk, or you can get a wet paintbrush and that erases it very nicely. And I'm just making these branches more defined with my chalk and making them kind of branch out and have other smaller branches. And I'm going to sketch down here. We got to make a branch going down into the fall section. So that branch is hanging down. And then I'm going to get my brush and put water on it, so I know my hand is in the way, but my brush is sort of erasing the inside part of the tree branches so I can define my shape a little bit better. I'm going in there with a wet brush and really kind of erasing what I don't want and keeping what I want. So you're just playing around with the chalk until you have a tree composition that you like. You can copy my tree composition for sure, or you can kind of create your own style of tree. The trick is just to make sure that you have branches that go in all 4 quadrants so that we can make our tree look like each of the 4 seasons. That was my 2, almost 3-year-old in the background adding his own soundtrack. That's his happy scream. But when you are done with your tree, we're going to move on to the next step of painting our tree in. So I'm using burnt umber and Oxide Black for this. I'm also using a number 11 round brush. I really liked using this brush for this tree. This brush it's a big round brush, but it's got a nice tip on it and it helps us with the branches because we can do some thick and thin techniques with it. So I'm going to I wet my brush and don't want it dripping wet, but you can see how it's got like a nice point on it. We're going to add a little bit of black into our burnt umber just to make it kind of a darker brown color. So a lot more burnt umber than the black, so probably 3:1 proportion. And I don't like to mix it all the way in my palette because I kind of like it when the brown and black sort of mix themselves, so we get a different variation of brown and black. And I'm starting at the bottom of my tree. So we have the trunk, it's kind of wide on the bottom and it gets smaller as you go up. So when you use this brush and you want a thicker stroke, you would press harder and you would use more of the bristles. When you want your stroke to go thinner, like what I did with that branch, I let go of the pressure on my brush and use the very tip of the brush for the smaller lines. You can see how small that line is that I just created. I'm using just that tip of the brush because your bristles on this brush go very much to a point, which allow you to create branches that are thinner. So we want to do the thick and thin technique here. You're pressing more firm for thicker, you're letting go pressure and using the very tip of the bristles for thinner. Okay, so for each of your branches, starting out thick, and sometimes for thick you got to do like multiple strokes to get it filled in all the way. And if your paint's not flowing, add a little bit of water to your brush and swirl it in on your palette like what we did when we did the wash in the background. Okay, so for this one we got thick. I'm releasing pressure and using just the tip of the bristles and the branches go to a point, and then you could go in there and add even more branches if you want, but I just did my chalk drawing and then later on I used the smaller brush for some really small branches. But you can get some very thin lines with this number 11 round brush. I actually really like this brush, very versatile for branches. And so I'm just filling in the rest of these branches. Again, if your paint's not flowing, swirl it into the water, swirl it into the paint. Sometimes it helps to twist your paintbrush when you load it on your palette. And so make sure your branches are nice and thick at the base, wherever they're branching off from. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm reloading, grabbing a little bit more black in there, swirling it into the water. Again, you don't want to add too much water. It should not be dripping down your canvas. And using that very tip of the brush for your thinner lines. This one's going down into the fall quadrant. This other round brush that I'm using is the number 3 round. So when you want to get those really extra tiny thin branches, this is a good brush for that. So it's still the same concept. When you're using a round brush, you press firm for thick and you let go and release pressure for thin. Using just the very tip of that brush will get you very thin, fine lines. And then over here on the trunk, I made the left and the right part of the trunk kind of wavy, so it's not a straight vertical line. It's kind of got some texture on the side. And then up here in the snow quadrant, I'm using the number 3 round brush. Again, I'm using that very tip of the brush to get your really fine lines, and you want to make sure your paint is flowing correctly with the good proportion of water to thin it down. And I'm just going to use my brush over here to sort of really define that shape of the trunk. Again, I don't want it to be a vertical geometric shape. I added sort of a curvy edge to give it a little bit more of a realistic looking tree sort of shape. And so this next step is completely optional. It is a little bit of a challenge because we're adding a highlight to our tree. I'm going to mix the titanium white to the burnt umber to create a light brown. I'm using my number 3 round brush, and I'm just going to go in on some of the edges of the tree. I'm going to pick a side, so I'm picking the left side, so this is the top part of the branch, adding that light in there and sort of blending it back in to that darker color, and it's just going to create some highlight and color variation. I'm not trying to render this realistic. I'm just trying to create some different tints of that brown in there. I say it's optional because it really only makes a subtle difference in this. The design of this painting looks perfectly fine if that tree was just a black, brown, solid color. But I'm just being extra creative in here and kind of playing around with these paints with this light brown, blending it in there. Maybe adding some texture into that trunk of the tree, so adding some sort of vertical wavy lines into the tree, blending that lighter brown in there creates some nice texture, and adding that same light brown kind of on the left side of a lot of these branches, so that'll give it some interesting colors and highlights and texture into your tree. And then if you don't like this, you can always go back over it. You can always go back and add more darker color if it's too light and you don't like the way it looks. So you can see what happens when you add that lighter color in there and blend it in. It kind of gives it a little bit of a realistic looking texture in there. And I'll keep talking about texture, highlight, texture, highlight. Okay, so when we are done with our tree, we want to carefully try to erase any excess chalk lines. You just want to make sure that you're not dragging wet brown paint into it. In fact, if you're a little bit nervous about erasing those chalk lines, you can wait till the very end of the painting, let your tree dry, and then erase the chalk lines. Me, I'm usually really impatient and I want those chalk lines out of the way, so I do the best I can to try to erase them right away. So I'm using that wet paintbrush. You can use any of the size paintbrushes to wet it and erase the chalk. So our chalk is gone, and this is actually probably my favorite part of the painting, adding the little snow in the background. And I'm using the back of my paintbrush handle, and I'm just stamping white dots. That's all it is. This is the titanium white, and I'm stamping with the back of my paintbrush handle. Super easy. And then if you want to add snow on your tree branches, you would use the actual bristles of the brush. This is the number 3 round brush, by the way. And so I'm just using that white, and anywhere the snow might land on the tree, any sort of horizontal or diagonal area or any sort of little corner where that snow would land is where I'm adding the snow. For this next part, I am using primary red and the number 3 round brush to paint the little cardinals. Okay, so these cardinals ended up being kind of large cardinals, and I erased them. Not really erased them. I painted over them and redid them. So if you want to see what they look like at the end of this painting, fast forward to the very end of this video to see how I did them. If you like the larger version cardinals, you can do what I'm doing here. But basically, this is just a simple cardinal shape. So we have like a teardrop shape for the body, a circle for the head, and he's got his little crown thing that's sticking out. I forget what the term is, the back feather of the head. And a triangle shape for his tail feather. And then I'm just sort of redefining the body shape. And so this, again, this is just the primary red number 3 round brush. And sorry about that shaky camera right there. And so I'm going to do the same thing over here. Except this cardinal is going to be facing the opposite direction. And then I'm going to use black and do his little beak that's sticking out, paint his wing, same thing for the other one, the wing and the beak. And then I went in there, rinsed my brush off, and used a little white for the eye. And then I added just a little bit of white to the back part of the cardinal and blended in a little bit. So I did the little bit of white on the body and the tail and the back of the head, and kind of added a tiny bit to the beak. So in my mind, those cardinals were way too big, and in the very end of this painting, I changed them. So you can fast forward and look at that if you want. And so we're going to do spring next, and we don't have pink in this painting kit, but we can make pink. To make pink, we're going to use the primary magenta and the titanium white and a little bit of that brilliant blue. That tiny bit of brilliant blue just gives it that kind of purplish undertone. You don't have to use the brilliant blue in it if you don't like what that makes. But we're on our palette, we're going to mix two different tints of it. So it's kind of a darker tint and a lighter tint of the pink. For that darker tint, I'd say it was like a 1:3 ratio, one primary magenta to 3 titanium white. You don't need a lot of red to make pink. You need more white than the red to make pink. For the even lighter one, add like 2 more splurts of white in there, so like a 6:1 ratio. It doesn't have to be exact, but just make sure when you're mixing the pink not to use too much primary red and use a lot of white. So we have the 2 different shades, 2 different tints of that pink, and this is the number 3 round brush, and I'm just painting dots. So I have quite a few cherry blossom tree tutorials on my website. They're all done the same way with a round brush, dots, and that's what I'm doing here. And actually I added a little bit more primary red to my palette to create a 3rd tint in there, so even a darker, if you want to use pure primary magenta in there, you can do that as well. But it looks more interesting when your dots are all different kinds of tints of that color. So we have darker dots, we have medium colored pink, and we have the lighter pink. And you can even get pure white and add the pure white in there and let that blend in with your dots. Another thing with cherry blossom clusters is we're going to paint in clusters. So I'm not just putting my dots everywhere, wherever. I'm putting them more in sort of clusters, if that makes sense. So they're really kind of dense together in some areas, and your clusters are kind of spread out. Okay. And of course you can do different style if you have your own style of cherry blossoms. You can even actually make them look like little flowers if you use your brush to paint little flower shaped, but I'm just sticking with dots. So here's my what I was mentioning about just adding white to your palette. So this is just the titanium white, and that adds a really pretty lighter pink in there. And the other thing about this is there's no water whatsoever here, so this paint is nice and thick, which is nice because it creates a really pretty texture. The paint itself will keep its form, so you'll be able to see your stroke in this paint. When it dries, you'll be able to see that thick stroke, which is a really pretty effect that it creates for this painting. You can see, you remember when we did the background, it was nice and thin. You're not going to see that stroke because it's very thin. But then we have our tree that we slightly watered down the tree, but now we have the top layer and it's this thick stroke, and you can see the texture in it. So it's a really versatile paint because you can change the consistency of it very easily. And so I'm not going to cover my entire blue with this. I want that blue sky still showing through, but I'm still doing clusters, and the clusters are sort of, they've got a lot of blue still showing through. And did dragonflies in the very end of this painting. So if you want dragonflies, make sure you leave some open spots for them. This next step, we are going to paint the mountain on the very bottom 2 quadrants of this painting, and I am back to my flat brush for this step. So we have a mountain. It is a medium gray color, and it's a watered down gray color. So to make that watered down medium gray, we're going to use the black and the white. Probably like 2 white, 1 black to make that medium gray, and water it down just slightly, not dripping water, but kind of the wash sort of consistency that we created in the background. I'm going to start at the bottom and take my 2 fingers to sort of measure it. So 2 fingers from the bottom, creating a horizontal line using that brush. And the top of the mountain is a bit wavy, so you want to make sure that that horizon line, that's that line going across, is lined up on both quadrants. And so, but the wavy part can look different on both quadrants. It's just the bottom part line needs to line up. And then if you accidentally paint over your tree, like I did, you could always get the burnt umber and paint back over it again. This next step is going to be using the palette knife. I love that this kit comes with a palette knife, and it's actually like a really nice palette knife. So we're going to use titanium white, lots of white in this painting, and grab that palette knife. We're going to scrape paint on the side of our palette knife, so it's right there on the side, because we're going to use this to create the water texture lines. And so you hold your palette knife sort of horizontally, and because there's paint on the side of it, it's scraping to create those horizontal lines. Same thing over here in the fall quadrant, so little horizontal lines. You can't always control a palette knife. You can, but you can't always control how much paint sort of ends up off of the palette knife and onto the canvas. So you want to kind of just not have to feel so in control and just kind of go with it. It creates these sort of abstract lines. I like the effect that it creates. If you don't like the palette knife, you could always do the same technique. Like, do you see what happened right there? A big chunk of white ended up off of it, and that's okay. But like what I was saying is, if you don't like the palette knife, you can always try this with a different brush. So you can use a little round brush to create horizontal lines. You can use a flat brush, and that's it. So when you're done with your palette knife, you want to just kind of wipe that paint off so it doesn't dry on there. It's not fun to clean dried paint off of a palette knife. And what I'm doing here with my brush, this is back to that flat brush. My gray is still kind of wet, so that was nice. I grabbed a little bit of white on my brush, just a tiny bit of white, and I'm blending some white in there just to lighten that mountain up a little bit. Maybe I know there's going to be a sun on the left. I don't know where the light source is on the summer quadrant, but I wanted to lighten that mountain up just a little bit. And so that's what I did, and blended it back down into the gray. And then we're going to do a sun. The sun is about a 1-to-1 ratio of yellow to white, maybe a little bit more white than yellow. But I'm mixing white and yellow, and then using my round brush, painting a circle that's going behind the mountain. And of course, if I accidentally paint over my mountain, I can always go back and redo my mountain. And then underneath that, I just use my round brush and using the rest of the paint that's on the brush till it sort of runs dry. More horizontal strokes under there that creates a reflection from the sun. And I went in and I touched up my mountain. The next thing I'm going to do are the fall leaves. So fall leaves, we're doing primary magenta and the primary yellow, the number 3 round brush, loading it in both the yellow and the red, creating clusters of dots. The same technique that I did with my cherry blossoms, only these ones are supposed to look like fall leaves, and so that ideally you want that yellow and red to sort of blend together to create some orange tones in there. And so I also did little dots on the very bottom of the painting, assuming the leaves have fallen down and they're either floating in the water, or I guess the tree's not floating in the water, so they're kind of by the tree. But it looks cool, so I did those on the bottom. And maybe we have some that are sort of flying or falling. And then I decided to do birds in this as well. So with that number 3 round brush and the black, water down that black slightly, but don't put too much water on it because these are very fine details. It may run if there's too much water. But just the tip of that brush to create that standard, bump lines and that looks like birds. Some of them are really tiny because they're way in the distance. Some are maybe slightly bigger to give it some dimension. So that's it for the fall quadrant, and we're going to do the summer one. The summer was done with Yellowish Green. This is very close to the brilliant yellow green if you're used to using the Liquitex color. So it's that sort of a light lime green looking color. And so I did that for the summer leaves, and I also ended up putting a little bit of white in there as well to give it some nice color variation. And I also did some green leaves on the bottom just to make it look a little balanced. Maybe there's some leaves floating in the lake, who knows. So there's my white. The white brightens that green up a little bit better. So you have some nice variation in color when you add the white in there. The white is mixing with the green as you're putting the dots. For the fireflies, I used primary yellow and titanium white. So first thing you do is you make a dot and you smear it with your finger. So dot, smear it with your finger, make a dot, smear it with your finger. These are the fireflies. And you can have them overlap the water, you can have them overlap the tree branches, overlap the trunk. And then after you smear it with your finger, go back with titanium white and make a dot in the middle, and that creates that really cool firefly technique. So this is the part of the painting where I mentioned how I decided to erase my cardinals. So there they are erased. You can see the dark gray still because it ended up being a little bit darker. But that didn't bother me. What really bothered me was my cardinals were too big. Sometimes we get obsessed with certain parts of our painting and it has to change no matter what. So that's what happened here. But actually it was a good test of this paint. It had a pretty good coverage. But so what I'm doing here is creating a smaller version of my cardinal, and that's what I did. So same shape, same form, technique, only smaller. And this is the number 3 round brush and the medium magenta. I did one cardinal flying. So it has that teardrop shape for the body and that triangle tail, but then one of the wings is sort of flying. And there's a back wing too, but we have the head and the beak. And I went back with the black, and again I did the beak, the wing, and then a little line on the tail of the flying one. I did a black. And then I went back with my white. And touched up my snow that I erased. There we go. Adding that more little dots of snow made it look not so bad with the big dark blotches in the background, but that's okay because my cardinals I'm more happy with the way my cardinals look now than they were before. So the last thing that I wanted to add was this spring quadrant needed something too. So I decided on dragonflies, ultramarine blue for the line, and without rinsing my brush, I added white. This is the number 3 round brush, and with the white I did the wings. So you know, this is such a tiny detail, and it's on an 8x10 canvas, so it's really tiny. But little ovals for the wings that are sort of forming like an X. So the wings are forming like an X, and adding a little bit of white in there on the body. And then I did a couple dragonflies. that is the last thing that I did to this painting, and this tutorial is coming to its conclusion. I hope that you enjoyed painting a 4 seasons tree with me. And the last thing I'm doing right here is signing my name with the number 3 round brush and the black. So if you are interested in using the Salvador Paint Kit for this painting, there is a coupon code on my blog post. So if you want to grab that code before purchasing the kit, you can do that. But other than that, thank you for watching this painting tutorial. Bye!